Do you love shooting photos but are frustrated with your results? Today I'm going to show you guys how to master manual mode so you can level up your camera skills in just 3 easy steps. So manual mode is just a different mode in your camera, just like auto mode or any other type of mode that you have. Look at the dial on the top of your camera and it'll show you all the different modes, all those little letters. M stands for manual, right? When you put it in manual mode, this gives you full control of all of your exposure tools. We're talking aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to set your camera for any situation. But first, we're talking about aperture. Aperture does 2 main things. It controls how much light's coming to your sensor, so your overall exposure, light or dark. It also controls your depth of field, or how much you want your background to be blurry, or how much of that background or the main subject you want to be in full focus. All right, the way aperture affects your overall exposure is by simply letting light in to your lens and restricting the amount of light that comes to your lens. That's literally what it does. So when you have a low aperture number, say like an f2.8, you literally have blades inside of your lens that will close up or open up. And when you have a lower number, those blades open up real wide so you have more light coming in. When you have a high number, say like an f22, those blades on your lens are going to close up real tight, restrict the amount of light that's heading there. And as far as the blurry background, when you have a lower aperture number, say like a 2.8 or 1.8, then you have a super blurry background and the depth of field is really shallow. But when you have a higher f number, like at f22, then you have a much greater depth of field and you have more of like an infinity focus type thing for like landscape shots. So like I said, for instance, if you're shooting a portrait, say you're shooting a portrait of just one single person and you're doing senior photos, whatever it might be, and you really want that blurry background to make your subject stand out, then you're going to drop your aperture number, right? So it's gonna let more light in, yes, but you're really doing it for the look. Now, one thing to keep in mind, in certain instances, like if I'm shooting a portrait of somebody, I'm probably not gonna dip down all the way to a 1.8 because 2 reasons. One reason is usually you'll be shooting that subject in the daytime, so you probably won't be able to drop down to 1.8. At a 1.8, the depth of field is so shallow that a lot of times you can be focused on somebody's eye and even like the tip of their nose will be out of focus. So that's not always ideal. Typically, if I'm shooting a portrait of somebody, I always shoot an f2.8 if I'm able to. Now, when it comes to landscape shots, you have to increase your f-stop number. So what you're going to be doing is, yes, you're going to be restricting the amount of light that goes to your sensor, but your depth of field is going to be more deep. Your focus is going to be a deeper focus. So you're going to get all that landscape in focus rather than just those bushes in the middle of the landscape and everything else is blurry. Now, when you're shooting group photos, you got to meet somewhere in the middle. So they're portraits, yes, you can't always shoot at a 2.8 with a group photo because everybody's gonna be standing, everybody's different heights, everybody's different distances away from the camera. So what you're gonna have to do is find a middle point. You're not gonna be able to drop down 2.8, but also like an f20 is not gonna be ideal either. So somewhere between like an f4 to an 8 or something like that should be pretty decent for getting a group photo because you want everybody's face to be in focus. Now, when you're shooting day versus night, when talking about aperture, daytime, like I said, you're gonna have to strike that balance. If you're shooting portraits during the day, and you want an f2.8, you're going to have to compensate with your shutter speed because you're going to be opened up more. You're going to have a blurry background, but it's daytime and you're going to have a lot more light to the sensor, so you're going to be overexposed if you don't compensate. So use your shutter speed to compensate. We'll get to shutter speed here in a second. So daytime, might have to use a little bit higher f-stop to avoid overexposure. Nighttime, there's less light, obviously, so you want as much light to the sensor as possible in a low light situation, so you're going to have to drop that f-stop number to a 1.8, 2.8, whatever you're able to. And then the only thing you have to worry about then is just focusing, because sometimes when you dip down that low to let so much light in, you can have some focusing issues. So that can be tricky too. All right, shutter speed, freezing or blurring motion. So shutter speed also has 2 main jobs: your overall exposure, light or dark, like with aperture, and it also affects your motion blur or freeze framing. Let's say, for instance, you're going to be shooting something that is moving. You're going to a soccer game, a football game, your kids are running around the yard, and you need to be able to shoot a subject that's moving a lot, moving really fast, but you want them to tack sharp, right? So you're gonna have to use a faster shutter speed. A shutter speed of 1/80th of a second is not going to be fast enough to catch motion because you're going to have blurred images. So if you're shooting a football game or your kids are running around or whatever it might be, depending on how fast they're moving, you can shoot up 1/500th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, higher. It just depends how much motion is actually being frozen, I guess. It just depends on how much motion is happening in the action when you're trying to freeze. The faster they're moving, the faster the shutter speed is going to have to be. Now, say you don't want to freeze frame something. Say you want motion blur. Say you're going to be shooting a waterfall. You don't want to freeze frame that because you want the motion blur of that water going down the waterfall, that nice, silky smooth motion blur of the water falling, or photographing a car at a racetrack and you really want to depict the motion, car can still be in focus, but you still want to depict that motion blur maybe in the background of the car. So then in that case, you'd have a slower shutter speed. Now in general, if you're just going to be walking around running a gun and you just want to have like a balance and you don't want to have to worry about the shutter speed, then you can just lock it into like anywhere from like a 1/100th of a second up to like a 1/250th of a second, in that range. And that's kind of like a balance if you're walking around, you're shooting handheld, that way you don't get blurred images. And you can shoot a little bit slower if you wanted to. I shoot 1/80th of a second all the time handheld, and it ends up fine, as long as you're not like super shaky or nothing like that. And obviously it depends on the situation. Now, when it comes to exposure, faster your shutter speed, the darker the image is going to be. So if you're jumping up to 1/1000th of a second, that's going to be darker than 1/80th of a second. So when you're using slower shutter speeds, you're letting more light in, and when you're using faster shutter speeds, you're restricting that light. So then again, you're going to have to compensate with your aperture. Now that we've already talked about aperture, you know how to work that too. So if you're shooting something and shutter is your priority, then use that aperture after the fact to lock in your exposure. ISO for brightness and noise. So ISO is the last piece of the puzzle when it comes to exposure. It mainly controls just how bright your image is going to be. So it takes the existing light that's available in your frame that your camera sees based on your aperture and based on your shutter speed, and it will amplify that light, or you can make it darker. And that's basically all it is. It's like a gain knob. It also can affect how much noise is going to be in your image. So when you raise your ISO numbers, you're going to be adding more grain to your photos, which is not a bad thing. It just depends on the look you're going for. And when you lower it, you're going to be reducing that grain. It's going to be looking like a cleaner image. Well, all digital cameras, they have it's called native ISO. It's like the ISO range that is good for that camera, that it can operate in and have the least amount of grain and have the image not fall apart. And a lot of cameras nowadays, like the Sony cameras or like the C70, I believe, they have dual native ISO. So they basically have two native ISOs, and when you get up to the top of the first set of native ISO, then it'll jump up to the next one. That also delivers clean image. But in general, the higher your ISO number and the brighter you're going to make it. Lower the ISO number, the darker you're going to make it, and the brighter you make it with ISO, you're adding more grain. In a bright condition during the day, you're going to be using ISO probably 100 up to 400. Anything after that, in lower light situations, if you have to jump up to like a ISO 1600 and above, that's, for darker situations, you're going to be brightening it up that way. But again, you could be adding noise to your image. In the daytime, you want your ISO to be as low as possible. In the nighttime, you want to make sure that you're only adding ISO after aperture and shutter speed cannot be compensated anymore. So if I'm shooting a portrait of one single person, I want my aperture to be a priority. So I'm going to change my aperture first. My aperture for this portrait is going to be 2.8 for a nice blurry background. It's bright sunny today, so it's a little overexposed. So now I'm going to have to dial my shutter speed and compensate for that. So in order to darken the situation with shutter speed, I'm going to have to increase my shutter speed, right? Which also means that I'm going to get a freeze frame, but that doesn't matter to me because my subject isn't, I'm not worried about whether they're moving or not, and I don't want a blurry image anyway, so I don't care about that. So now I have my f-stop locked in, I have my shutter speed locked in, exposure is looking good, and the last one on the list is ISO. Now say I really wanted to not have to be shooting like 1/250th of a second shutter speed, and that's the range that I had to be in. Then what you could do is just get to the shutter speed that you want, and then if you needed it brighter or darker, just use your ISO last and adjust that. So all that to say, ISO needs to be adjusted after aperture and shutter speed are already locked in, and they can't be used to compensate anymore. All right, so we'll work through 4 real-world scenarios, right? If we're shooting a portrait, we're going to be shooting that aperture wide. That just means a lower aperture number, opening it up. Why? Because we'll get a more blurry background. So aperture is going to be priority because we want that blurry background. So we set that to a 2.8, then we adjust our shutter speed to compensate, and then we adjust the ISO if we need to after that. And as daytime, you want your ISO as low as possible. Okay, cool. So if you're shooting a landscape shot, you want that whole landscape to be in focus. You want a deep level of focus. So you're going to have a higher f-stop number. So let's say like an f11, an f20, or whatever it might be, depending on how big the landscape is. But you're going to want that aperture to be priority, and you're going to want aperture to be smaller. It's going to restrict light, yes, but you want everything to be in focus, so you're going to have a higher aperture number, so everything has a deeper level of focus, okay? So we have a higher aperture number that's going to make it dark. So now we use our shutter speed to compensate for that, to brighten it back up. And then if we still need to brighten it back up after the shutter speed's been compensated, then we use our ISO, and then we're good to go. Action sports, it's going to be shutter priority because if something's moving, you're thinking about the overall motion blur. You're not going to be thinking about how blurry the background is on the football player. You're going to be thinking about whether or not you catch his motion or whether or not he's going to be super blurry or freeze frame or whatever. In that instance, we we change shutter speed first, and you want a fast shutter speed for action sports, because like I said, you want a freeze frame typically. And then after that, so you lock in your shutter speed, and then you do your aperture after that, compensate any lightness or darkness with your aperture, and then after you get your aperture locked in, then you go to the ISO for any final tweaking. In a nighttime photography situation, you're going to want a slower shutter to let more light in, adjust your aperture, and adjust your ISO accordingly. The only tricky thing with night photography is that you're probably going to want to use a tripod, because if you shoot a slow shutter speed to get more light in, you're going to have to hold your camera very still, because if you set it at for like 1/30th of a second, you're not going to be able to shoot handheld because it's going to be too blurry. You're going to need to use a tripod. So that's the main thing. That's one thing to think about when you're shooting nighttime. All right, just to recap, because that was a lot of information, aperture controls depth of field, shutter speed controls motion blur, and the ISO is basically just brightness, how bright or how dark you want it after you adjust the first two. So I would encourage you guys to go out there and practice, start shooting, start using your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO just to get better, because it's the only way you're going to master this manual mode. So get out there, start shooting, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.